2nd of October 1985, Enfield, North London. Sergeant Gary Gavin of the Worcestershire and Sherwood Foresters stood at attention. He was about to receive something, a new rifle, the first one issued under the new programme. Generals were there, defence correspondents, foreign military attachés. And Sergeant Gavin accepted an L85A1 individual weapon. The weapon that would replace the Lee Enfield's direct successor. That would replace the rifle British soldiers had carried through Korea and Aden and Ulster. That would carry the British Army into the 21st century. The men at RSAF Enfield were proud of it. The Ministry of Defence was proud of it. Britain had become one of the first NATO militaries to field a bullpup service rifle. The magazine sat behind the trigger. The barrel was 20 inches long, inside a package just 31 inches total. Compact. Optically sighted as standard. The future. Within 2 years, soldiers were taping the top cover shut to stop it popping open mid-patrol. Within 5 years, the mod's own internal report had catalogued more than 50 separate design faults. Within 6 years, British soldiers carried it into the First Gulf War, and it jammed in the sand. Not occasionally, systematically. The rifle was still in service 40 years later. The question is not why it survived. The question is what the system did and refused to do to keep it there. Britain had a genuine problem in the late 1960s, and it was not a small one. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, the British variant of the Belgian FN FAL, fired a 7.62 by 51mm NATO round. That round had always been considered too powerful by British planners, who had fought hard for a lighter intermediate cartridge at the NATO Standardization Conference in 1954 and lost. America had insisted on the heavier round, and Britain had gone along with it. For 15 years, every British infantryman had carried a rifle they knew was a compromise. Semi-automatic only, where the Soviets had gone fully automatic with the AK-47, and heavy, where the new generation of combat was moving towards shorter, faster, lighter weapons. The L1A1 weighed 4.3 kilograms empty and stretched to 1,143 millimeters with its fixed stock. In jungle environments, in urban streets, in the back of armored vehicles, that length mattered. And the round it fired was overpowered for a weapon that could not go automatic. British soldiers in Northern Ireland found themselves in close-range engagements with a rifle designed for open country fighting at 300 meters. In 1969, the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield began work on a replacement. The design requirement was specific, shorter than the SLR, optically sighted as standard, capable of automatic fire, and chambered for a new, lighter round Britain was developing, a 4.85 by 49mm intermediate cartridge. The bullpup configuration was the engineering answer to the length problem. Push the magazine behind the trigger. The action sits in the stock. You get a 20-inch barrel, which matters for ballistics, inside a package shorter than most submachine guns. When NATO announced ammunition standardization trials in 1977, Britain entered its 4.85mm round and believed it had a serious case. NATO chose the Belgian SS109 5.56mm round instead. Enfield rechambered the design. The weapon was adopted in 1985 as the L85A1, 5.56 by 45mm NATO, 30-round magazine, 4 times SUSAT optical sight as standard issue. Production ran to over 320,000 rifles by 1994. The design logic was sound. A shorter, lighter, faster weapon with a standard optical sight for every rifleman, not just snipers. That was what the British Army needed. What it received was a different matter. The men who built the L85A1 at Enfield knew something was wrong by 1986. The troop trials that year and into 1987 began returning results the factory did not want to see. The LSW's bipod failed to lock. The plastic furniture of both weapons dissolved on contact with standard issue insect repellent. Metal components rusted faster than any predecessor in jungle conditions. The trigger blade, designed with a flat back, collected and compacted snow rather than clearing it, preventing the trigger from travelling its full arc, which meant it could not release the hammer. The weapon simply stopped firing, in cold weather. The fix was redesigning the blade to a wedge profile. That one was caught early. Most problems were not. The aluminium magazines flexed under load, their feed lips too fragile to survive rough handling in the field. The magazine release catch sat where a soldier's webbing could catch it without warning, dropping the magazine at the worst possible moment. The top cover over the gas mechanism, held by a catch too weak for the job, kept popping open under fire until soldiers in Ulster started taping it shut as a matter of course. The firing pin fractured in automatic mode. The gas system demanded constant lubrication, but in sandy conditions that lubrication drew grit straight into the working parts, locking the action solid. The weapon had to be kept wet in precisely the environments where staying dry was the only option. In February 1991, British forces with the 1st Armoured Division crossed the Iraqi border as part of Operation Granby. They had been in theatre since late 1990, and the desert had been testing their equipment long before the ground war began. The L85A1 failed that test. The Lancet report, officially Equipment Performance SA80, during Operation Granby, the Gulf War, documented the outcome directly. Stoppages were frequent, despite, in its own words, the considerable and diligent efforts of soldiers to prevent them. Neither the rifle nor the LSW had ever passed sand trials. The lubrication problem that soldiers had flagged in training made the weapon unworkable in the one environment it had just been sent to fight in. The report catalogued more than 50 faults. When it was leaked to the press, the MOD declared it a fabrication. It then conceded the document was genuine, but insisted it was unofficial and lacked credibility. 7 of those faults were subsequently addressed. The other 43 were not. The soldiers carrying L85A1s in the Gulf had spent years learning to live with what the report confirmed. They taped the covers, managed the lubrication, found workarounds for every deficiency the procurement system had declared acceptable. British Special Forces had evaluated the L85 during troop trials and walked away from it. The SAS preferred the M16. The rifle that Britain's own Special Forces wouldn't carry was the standard individual weapon for every other soldier in the army. Here is what the procurement system decided after reading the Lancet report. Not replacement. Replacement was too expensive. The MOD had spent the money. Over 320,000 rifles at a cost the government did not want to revisit. So in 1992, the ministry began exploring what modifications might be possible. And then it sat with that question for 5 years. In 1997, 6 years after the Gulf War had exposed the weapon's failures before the world's press, it was finally decided to upgrade the existing stock. The contract did not go to a British manufacturer. There was no longer a British small arms manufacturer capable of doing the work. RSAF Enfield had closed. Nottingham had closed. Britain's entire military small arms industrial base, built across generations from the pattern room to the proof house, had been rationalised out of existence during the privatisation years. The contract went to Heckler Koch, a German firm that happened, at that point, to be owned by British Aerospace, which meant the work was technically still British by ownership, if not by craft or geography. 200,000 L85A1 rifles were sent to H&K for conversion at £400 per weapon. £80 million to correct faults the British soldiers had been documenting since 1986. H&K redesigned the cocking handle, strengthened the bolt and extractor, reworked the hammer assembly to reduce the most persistent stoppages, thickened the magazine housing, and applied Teflon coatings to the gas components. The new designation was L85A2. Conversion ran from 2000 to 2006. The first A2s reached Afghanistan in December 2001, 3 months before the conversion program had formally finished, and reports of jamming came back almost immediately. The MOD attributed the problems to poor maintenance discipline. The Army attributed them to the rifle. The truth was closer to the MOD's position. The A2, when cleaned properly, worked. Battlefield mission trials put it at a 95% pass rate. Its nearest rival in comparative testing reached 47%. Mean rounds between failure was 25,200. By any objective standard, the rebuild had produced a serviceable weapon. But no other major military has ever adopted it. The rifle that Britain rebuilt at a cost of £80 million, that beat every competitor in independent reliability testing, never sold a single unit on the export market. The reputation the A1 had earned between 1985 and 1991 proved impossible to shift. That is the dark reason the L85 is still in service. Not because it became the best rifle Britain could field, because by the time it was good enough to replace, Britain had already spent too much to walk away, had already lost the industrial capacity to build something better at home, and had set in motion a replacement program, Project Greyburn, that as of early 2026 remained in the concept phase, with the L85A3s projected out of service date sitting at 2030. 45 years from first issue to planned withdrawal, for a rifle that was broken when it arrived. The L85A2 went to Iraq. It went back to Afghanistan. Measured against what the A1 had been, it held up. Measured against anything else, the story remained what it had always been, a procurement system spending the next 2 decades managing a problem it had created in the first one. The A2 did carry one genuine advantage that rarely got acknowledged. Its full-length 20-inch barrel produced higher muzzle velocities than the shorter carbines that most Allied forces had moved to by then. The M4 carbine that American soldiers carried into the same engagements had a 14.5-inch barrel, nearly 6 inches shorter. In Helmand Province, where contacts frequently opened at distance, that gap mattered less than weight of fire in tactical air. But at the ranges where infantry were closing to clear compounds, the L85A2 was not being outshot on ballistics. The Susat optical sight tells a similar story. Standard issue since 1985, it meant that British infantrymen had been going to war with a 4 times magnified optic for 15 years before American forces began issuing equivalent sights across the board. In the early years of the Afghan campaign, a proportion of American soldiers were still fighting with iron sights. British soldiers were not. That edge, born from a design decision taken in 1969 and somehow preserved through all the turmoil of the rifle's production, never received much credit. In part because it was inseparable from a weapon the army had spent 20 years trying to apologize for. In 2016, the army began converting A2 stocks to the A3 standard. A new Picatinny rail handguard, updated receiver, 100 grams off the total weight, improved environmental coating. The A3 entered service in 2018. By February 2025, the mod held 125,276 L85A2 rifles and 40,144 L85A3 rifles. Over 165,000 L85 variants still in British service, 40 years on from the day Sergeant Gary Gavin swapped his SLR for the future. Project Greyburn, the formal replacement program, received a pipeline notice to industry in January 2026. It remains in the concept phase. The A3's projected out-of-service date is 2030. By that point, the L85 will have been in service for 45 years, 12 years longer than the L1A1 it replaced, and well past every retirement date the mod ever set for it. The rifle that struggled through its own sand trials outlasted them all, not because anyone decided it was worth keeping, but because no one could agree on the cost of finally letting it go. Meanwhile, the edges have already moved on. The Ranger Regiment and the Royal Marines Strike Companies received the Knight's Armament L403A1 in 2023. A conventional rifle, not a bullpup, as though the bullpup experiment is being quietly wound down from the outside in, while the centre waits for a budget that keeps failing to materialise. Every generation of military procurement begins with a problem worth solving. The British Army in 1969 needed a shorter, lighter, optically sighted rifle capable of automatic fire. That requirement was real. The EM2 program from the late 1940s had already shown the bullpup concept could work. The engineers at Enfield were building towards something that could genuinely change what a British infantryman could do. What the L85's history shows is the distance between what a procurement system sets out to build and what it actually delivers, and then how long it takes to admit the difference. The failures of the A1 were not accidents of engineering. They were the result of factories running out of production lines under the near certainty of closure, of quality standards bent to meet schedule, of ministers who had committed to a number and could not afford for that number to be wrong. The mod knew. The Lancet report was not a revelation to the people who read it. It was a written record of what they already knew. Their first response was to call it a forgery. That decision, to deny, then minimize, then quietly absorb, is the real explanation for why the L85 is still in British service. Replacing the rifle would have required acknowledging what the report said. Rebuilding it, at a cost approaching the original contract, allowed the institution to treat the problem as a technical one, not a systemic one, not an accountability one. 40 years on, British soldiers still carry a rifle no foreign army ever bought, rebuilt by a German firm because Britain had already dismantled the factories that might have done it differently. The replacement program sits in its concept phase. The retirement date keeps moving. Military institutions do not keep broken weapons in service because they don't know they're broken. They keep them in service because knowing is not the same as being able to act. The L85 is not still in British hands because it became good enough. It is still in British hands because the cost of admitting it was wrong arrived long before the money to put it right. If you want to understand how that happens, subscribe and turn the notifications on. There's more where this came from.